on the show.
Oh, wow.
Yes, yeah, I remember.
You want to do the picture thing? Oh, yeah. Hopefully you've had a good day.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Just make sure you do that.
Let him get his show over with.
We are live.
He's got to be on live. Oh, is it? Already live. We would not want to hold back.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mayor McAdams. I'm the chair of Ankeny Area Democrats. Thank you for coming out. Pete Buttigieg is a millennial mayor, Afghanistan war veteran, and a husband. He is in his 8th and final year as the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He was first elected mayor in 2011 at only 29 years old and re-elected in 2015 with 80% of the votes. Under his leadership, the South Bend has reimagined its role in the global economy with job growth and major investment in advanced industries with a focus on data and technology. Pete served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy Reserve and took an unpaid 7-month leave during his mayoral term for a deployment to Afghanistan. For his counterterrorism work, he earned the Joint Service Commendation Medal. In 2017, he ran for the Democratic National Committee chair, earning national praise for his clear message and emphasis on rebuilding the Democratic Party from the ground up in every community. He currently serves as the chair of the Automation and the Impacts on America's Cities Task Force at the United States Conference of Mayors. The Washington Post has called him the most interesting mayor you've never heard of. And President Obama named him one of the 4 Democrats who represents the future of the Democratic Party. A Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, a graduate of Harvard, he lives with his husband, Chasten, in the same South Bend neighborhood where he grew up with their 2 rescue dogs, Truman and Buddy. Ankeny Area Democrats welcomes Pete Buttigieg.
Well, thanks for the warm welcome. Thanks for the introduction, and a big congratulations to Ankeny Area Democrats, because I see so much of what's going right with our party and with our country happening with, for example, victories like Heather Mattson's victory right here in this state legislative district. Oh, she's here. There you are. All right. Good to see you. Welcome. You're a busy person right now, so thank you. But thank you also for demonstrating that some of the assumptions people make about our communities aren't right. That if we work hard, if we work every district, every door, and speak to communities that maybe haven't heard a Democratic voice in a long time, that good things will happen. I see my friend Andrea Phillips here, who introduced me to Ankeny in the first place. So thanks so much for the work that you're doing. And the thing that most excites me about this crowd is its intergenerational character, because I think that's very much what's at stake in both our project and in 2020. But I'll come back in a minute to what I mean by that. Let me start by sharing a little bit about South Bend, because maybe you've had the pleasure of visiting our city, but maybe you haven't. We're a straight shot up I-80, pretty easy to get to our home from here in Iowa. And it's a community that I love. It's a community I believe in. But it's a community that went through a lot. We were characterized at the beginning of this decade as one of America's 10 dying cities. And we represented what was happening in many parts of the industrial Midwest, that with the departure of the auto industry and the loss of thousands of jobs, there was a sense that some of our communities might never make it, might never come back. And I grew up, I'm afraid, believing that message that success meant getting out, getting away, and going as far as you could. And I did, in some ways, do that. I got an education, first on the East Coast, then overseas. But the further I got from home, the more I realized it meant something to be from the Midwest. I realized that it meant something that I was from somewhere in particular, and that where I belonged was home. And to make a very long story short, South Bend, my home, is now on a completely different trajectory. We still have plenty of major challenges as a community, but we've begun growing again. We've dealt with challenges like vacant and abandoned houses and job loss. We've seen many, many people lifted out of poverty in our city in recent years. And it's because of the way our community came together and admitted that the future wasn't going to look like the past. Acknowledged that something like Studebaker, the big automaking presence of the 1920s through 60s in our city, wasn't going to come back, but we were. And I wanted to talk about how. And the reason I'm bringing this up here, what sounds maybe like something a little bit provincial, a mayor coming to tell the story of one city in Indiana, is that I think it's got a lot of relevance for what's happening in America right now. We have seen some dreadful things in the last few years: the divisiveness, the rise of hate speech, children in cages. We're seeing things that we didn't believe were true or possible in our country. And the thing that's most troubling in all of that for me is the idea that what America needs most is to look backwards. That what America needs most, especially in terms of the industrial Midwest, is resentment and nostalgia. That's how our part of the country is being characterized, especially in many people from the East and West Coasts who are trying to take our measure and understand what we're about. I don't think we're about that at all. I think we are willing to recognize that the past will be different from the future, but we honor our past. And we build on that. And we build on that in new ways that are especially important if a generation like mine is going to be able to make it. I belong to the generation that grew up with school shootings as the norm. I was in high school when Columbine happened. And since then, school shootings are sometimes not even newsworthy. I belong to the generation that's going to pay the bill for the tax cuts on billionaires that were passed recklessly by the last Congress. The generation that is already on the business end of climate change and facing climate problems that are only going to grow deeper in our lifetime. And I believe that our generation has something to offer to make sure that America continues to be a country where at every turn we're better than we were before. I believe that our party, the Democratic Party, also needs to learn to talk more comfortably about things that only conservatives and Republicans have talked about in recent years, starting with freedom. So freedom didn't used to be something that one party monopolized. It used to be a basic American value. And I believe at a moment like this, when freedom is in retreat, whether you're looking around the world at places like Russia and Saudi Arabia, or whether you're looking right here at home, I believe freedom needs new defenders who understand that government is only one of the things that can make people unfree. That it's actually our values that will help expand freedom for the next generation. Because you're not free if, for example, you can't start a small business because leaving your job would mean losing your health care. That you're not free if consumer protections have been erased so that you can't sue a credit card company even after they get caught ripping you off. And in my personal experience, you're most certainly not free if a county clerk gets to tell you who you ought to marry because of their interpretation of their religion. And on that note, let me introduce to you my husband, Chasten, who's in the very back of the room. Freedom to organize for better working conditions, freedom to live a life of your choosing is something I believe in this moment that only people from our side of the aisle can and must defend. I believe in democracy. I think our party is named after democracy for some very good reasons that we shouldn't be afraid to talk about. Whether it's things that are beginning to get their due in the press conversation, like the fact that dollars are sometimes outranking people and we've got to get money out of politics, or whether it's the fact that districts in many parts of this country are drawn to where politicians are choosing their voters instead of the other way around. Or things that aren't being talked about as much, like the fact that our fellow American citizens in places like D.C. or places like Puerto Rico get less of a say in political decisions, even though they are just as American and just as hardworking and have just as much at stake as the rest of us. Or the fact that the Electoral College has overruled the American people twice in my short lifetime, that one might think that in a democracy, the person who gets the most votes as a general rule ought to be the one who wins. And that in a state like mine, most years our vote doesn't even matter. We might as well be in Puerto Rico or D.C. Because of the way the Electoral College kind of rubs out the relevance of so many states. So we got to talk about making sure our democratic republic is a little more democratic. And third, I want to talk about security. Because again, security is something that I'm afraid our side of the aisle kind of left to the others to talk about for a long time. But as somebody who was sent to war on the orders of an American president, I take security very personally. And I also believe there's a lot more to security than traditional security, like the military security that I participated in uniform, or border security, which is absolutely an important part of American security. But what about cybersecurity? You can't build a wall that's going to stop the attacks on our country that are happening in cyberspace even as we speak. And how about election security? Because if our democracy can be undermined through foreign attacks, I doubt that very much anything by way of traditional weaponry can keep anybody safe. And how about climate security? How about recognizing at a moment when cities have been inundated, including mine, we experienced a 500-year flood and a 1,000-year rainfall within 18 months of each other, which is some really peculiar mathematics. California basically caught fire, and these problems are accelerating. So climate is absolutely a security issue, but we can't leave the management of that security issue to people who are afraid to acknowledge that it even exists. These 21st century security concerns, I believe, deserve leadership from a new generation. And I'm so excited to see in the U.S. Congress, in state houses around the country, so many fantastic young leaders stepping forward. And I guess I'm offering myself up as a member of that generation of leaders, coming from admittedly a non-traditional background to be in the 2020 conversation, but maybe, just maybe at a moment when the less you have to do with the things that are going on in Washington, D.C. right now, the better, and a little more of what's going right in our cities and towns is exactly what we need to export to D.C. before they export the way they do things to us. So that, in a nutshell, is who I am and why I'm here. This is our first day in Iowa since we rolled out our exploratory committee. The response has been tremendous. The response has been moving. It's also been edifying because I've learned very quickly that people in this state take the early state status that you have very seriously and show up with curveballs and really smart, really perceptive, and really difficult questions. So just before I submit to some of those questions, let me also ask some of the members of our team who are in the room to just wave really quickly so you can get to know them. They're working incredibly hard. They are here to help make sure we get to know each other, and I hope you'll follow up with them as time goes on. So with that, let me stop talking and see what questions there are. There's one front and center, sir.
Well, you're the second thing I know about South Bend besides it's in the exact halfway point between here and my family in Buffalo.
Oh, wow. All right.
Exact halfway.
So do you stop off and fill up?
Yeah, yeah, actually. The Costco and
Yeah. Good. We've been there.
I'm a member of the Jewish community, and so one of the things that I'm very concerned about is the BDS movement and Israel. And I'm wondering what your position on the BDS movement and Israel is.
Yeah, so I was just in Israel in May of this year, or last year. It was my first chance to go, and I got a much deeper understanding of what's been achieved there, but also the complexity and the issues that are there. I don't see how BDS advances America's ability to be an honest broker of the situation there. I do think that Israelis, with, I hope, support from members of the American Jewish community, can confront some of the challenges that are ahead when it comes to how you can be a Jewish state and a democracy and be safe. And continue to be a great ally to America and play the role that they have as the world's only Middle East democracy. But I think that's, you know, in many ways I left that trip with more questions than answers and an awareness that any simple solution is not going to cut it when it comes to the future of the Middle East. Thanks for the question. Sir.
So you've been in Afghanistan.
Yes, sir.
What would you envision as the long-term role of the United States to help Afghanistan in the future?
Well, first of all, we got to acknowledge that we just can't go on like this. We can't have endless war in Afghanistan or anywhere else. There are people who are now old enough to be deployed to Afghanistan who weren't even alive when 9/11 happened. Now, I care about that mission. I put my life on the line for that mission. I also believe that we need to be realistic that we're not going to have a Western-style Scandinavian democracy in Afghanistan anytime soon. We just need to make sure that it's not a place that can come back and harm us. And I believe that can be done without an indefinite commitment of American troops. It is encouraging to see that the Taliban are in talks in Doha with the U.S. because that's an indication that if they are serious about being willing to put down their arms, then we have a way forward there. I am, though, a little bit concerned that it seems like the Afghan government, the elected democratic Afghan government, has been left on the sidelines of those talks. So I hope that if we expect a peace to endure, sooner rather than later we find more robust ways to include the government of Afghanistan at the table. It is a hauntingly beautiful country. It's one that I care about, but America cannot be the guarantor of stability and peace beyond what it takes to keep Americans safe here at home. Yes?
Hi. So I am also a part of the LGBTQ community. Specifically, I am non-binary. And so politics can be a very hostile place for people who don't identify as cis or straight, and especially if they aren't white. So what would you say has been your inspiration for continuing to pursue politics despite the adversity that you face as a as someone who is gay, I guess?
Yeah.
And also, what would you do to help encourage other LGBTQ people, especially those of color, to continue to pursue those ideas of promoting freedom and producing freedom?
Yeah. It's such an important question. I think it's part of what I'm getting at when I talk about freedom. And there's another word that maybe helps address that concern too, and it's the idea of belonging. Everybody wants to belong in their community. And choices made by politicians can make that easier, can make that harder. You know, my marriage is the most important thing in my life, and it exists by the grace of a single vote on the U.S. Supreme Court. It's one of the reasons I feel so intimately why politics matters. But it's also the tone and what leadership does. Look, high school, at least for me, high school is a pretty tough place to get through, even if you're not part of the LGBTQ community, right? Let alone if you are. And so making it harder for example, a transgender kid who just has to go to the bathroom like everybody else, is the exact opposite of what we hope leaders do, whether they're mayors or whether they're presidents. We've seen some lurches in the wrong direction. I mean, whether it's you know, picking on troops willing to put their lives on the line, transgender troops in the military, or whether it's the rise in hate crimes and hate speech, or the inability to pass the Federal Equality Act. But I also take enormous courage from what has changed, from the things that are different. Frankly, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have believed that either you could be out or you could be in politics, not both. And now I'm addressing a room full of people in Iowa about my hopes for our country with my husband looking on in the back of the room. It shows that if you, it's pretty cool. You know, when I came out, Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana. We had no idea. It was the middle of a re-election campaign. We had no idea what would happen to me. I got elected with 80% of the vote. So I find that more often, not always, but more often than not, if you treat people the way you wish they were, they will often respond by modeling that. And I have great faith and great hope for the future for that reason. Thank you. Yes?
There's been a lot of talk about the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to sort of get your perspective of what that means to you and then what your vision is in sort of that area.
So I think the arrival of the Green New Deal in the conversation is not a moment too soon, and I support the goals that were articulated in the resolution that was passed or that was introduced spelling out the framework of the Green New Deal. Now, that said, we got to be candid that this is a set of goals more than it is a policy, right? There are a lot of things that need to be spelled out before this turns into something actionable. But this is the right direction to be going in. And again, to me, conceptually, the foundation of it is the acknowledgement that we are in a kind of emergency when it comes to climate. And if you see the things that have happened in our climate, how can this not be an emergency? And that calls for emergency measures, extraordinary measures. Now, the good news is often Americans have risen to emergencies in ways that lift all of us up. And I think that's why the metaphor of the New Deal is so inspired. Because the New Deal was a response to the Depression and the war, and it wound up establishing some of the things that we now rely on as part of the bedrock of America being what we are. Social security, the idea that aging will never be a poverty sentence. The moves that made it possible for us to build the infrastructure that we now enjoy as a country, although we got to kind of do that again to get to the next turn of the wheel. I guess it shouldn't take a depression or a war to get the sense of urgency to do those things. And so if we can, just once in our national life, mount that kind of effort before rather than after a calamity, that will reflect so well, and it's such an American thing to do. So there's a lot of work to be done on what the details will look like, how exactly we'll get there. There are elements that weren't in the framework that I'd like to see more of. Just as a mayor, for example, how we support cities growing and developing on patterns that are more sustainable, that we've done a lot of work on at home in South Bend. But I believe that we need to act with the kind of urgency that is called for in that Green New Deal, and I'm very glad that it's on the table.
There's been talk on think tanks on both sides of the aisle about a negative income tax or a universal basic income. What, either supplanting or replacing the current system. What is your take on that?
Yeah, if you didn't hear in the back, the question was about a negative income tax or universal basic income. And I think the time has arrived for that conversation. I haven't reached a considered view on kind of how we would set it up or what the right levels would be. I'm eagerly watching what's going on with my friend Michael Tubbs in Stockton, California, where they're actually doing literally doing an experiment to see how this works. I will say, as somebody who works on policy for a living, there have been moments when we have developed a very elaborate policy contraption to try to solve some problem in education or in public health. And it turned out that the most efficient and cost-effective way to solve that problem was to just make sure people were a little less poor. The relationship between things like third-grade reading levels or lead poisoning, strictly on income, even before you get to the other factors that go in there, are incredibly powerful. So whether we're talking about an expanded earned income tax credit, whether we're actually talking about a negative income tax or cash payments, which, by the way, we already have in Alaska, right, in terms of the energy dividend up there, I think it deserves to be taken seriously. There are a lot of other policy mechanisms we should consider, too. And so I'm not there yet, I guess, is the honest answer. But I'm intrigued by it, and I think it's a healthy debate for us to begin to have, especially as evidence comes in from the on-the-ground experiments on how that would actually help people's lives. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by your statements on freedom and expanding that. 80 years ago, it was Roosevelt, the year before, Pearl Harbor, that had his four freedoms. And his last one was from fear.
Yes.
And I kind of take that in two ways. We talk a lot about security building up the military, getting prepared to do the fight. I think there's another way to get freedom from fear is to have trust that we as a society are there for each other.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you have any examples how you've done that in South Bend or how you anticipate doing that on a national level.
Yes, thank you for that. So again, for those in the back, the question referenced Roosevelt's fourth freedom, freedom from fear, and the relationship of fear and trust, and how you build up trust across a country. And I agree. I think trust is one of the biggest things that keeps us safe. At the city level, I think about it a lot because, in fact, I should probably pause here, because if all you know about South Bend is that you see us 6 times a year when we got football games going on, you may not be aware that we're not a typical college town. We're not the kind of racially homogenous, tidy, wealthy community that you might picture. We're actually largely low income, and we're very diverse. We're about 45% non-white. And so I learned very quickly that, especially when we had things like racially sensitive officer-involved shootings or other things that threatened to pull our community apart, that one of the most important things an executive can do, whether it's a mayor or at some other level, is just holding a community together and doing what you can, whether it's just as a walking symbol of the community or whether it's through policy, to build that kind of trust. We had a lot of issues with trust when we went to deal with this huge problem we had of vacant and abandoned houses, because people in neighborhoods that had been neglected felt like maybe we were coming in to do something to them. And so we did dozens of public meetings to establish what we were really trying to do was work with them and deliver results for them, so that by the end, more people than not in the neighborhoods that were most anxious about what City Hall was coming to do to them were saying, what took you so long, and can you do some more? I would add one other thing, which is outside of my city experience, which is from my military experience. So one of the things that happens in the military is you learn to trust people with your life who are frankly not the kind of people you would ordinarily break bread with. They're just from a different background or have different politics or for whatever reason are not people you might have got to know otherwise. And my job frequently involved driving or guarding vehicles on convoys outside the wire. And when somebody gets in your vehicle, you learn to trust them and they learn to trust you. And they could not have cared less whether I was a Democrat or Republican. They could not have cared less whether I was going home to a girlfriend or a boyfriend or what country my father immigrated from. They just want to know if I'd studied the intel briefs and knew where to look out for the IEDs, right? And so I think we need more of that, but it shouldn't require a war in order for that to happen. And that's why I think national service deserves to be taken more seriously in the U.S. right now, too. And we need to create more national service opportunities to build that fabric of trust that you're talking about, because I think that's very important. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about how when you're a mayor, you're pragmatic.
Yeah.
And how are you going to bring that to Washington? You just talk, let's say you win.
Yeah.
Be nice if you win.
You make it sound like an outlandish proposition.
Let's say you won. What is the first 100 days? What are your priorities? How are you going to change Washington?
Yeah, so I think coming again from the city level, as you say, a mayor's got to be pragmatic, right? Like one thing you'll never see is a city government where they have a policy disagreement, like if I'm having a battle with my council, and the consequence is you shut the city government down. That's just not going to happen, right? Can you imagine? I mean, we deliver water. You need water to live. So it just won't happen. So we just solve it. It's not always easy, and sometimes the politics is fierce, but it happens. We figure out a way to get it done, and we need that attitude in Washington. In terms of a governing agenda, I also think it's the case that a lot of ideas that maybe have been characterized as to one side are actually consensus ideas. Some of these ideas around democracy that I talked about earlier and making our democracy more democratic. Infrastructure. You know, there was the one thing that a lot of us maybe kind of sort of believed this administration might actually do across party lines, and it turned out their infrastructure plan was a plan for us in our cities to do all the infrastructure, which we do already. But if there was a real plan, you know, I think that would bring people together. I think there are a lot of ideas from teacher pay to common sense gun safety measures that the vast majority of American people are for, but not necessarily the majority of the American Congress. And so finding those consensus items, some sleeper items that maybe people don't realize there's a consensus around until you get out there and propose it, I think could really help knit people together. And then there would be accountability on the congressional side for living up to those expectations that Americans have, because Americans are clearly ready for something very, very different than what we have. I know you were waiting with a question.
So one of your biggest assets is going to be that you have tangible proof of the good work you've done as mayor in South Bend.
Yep.
You talked about South Bend being one of the top 10 dining cities in America and where it's at now. Obviously, the other side is going to be touting the economy and how well it's doing, probably taking the credit for it. And one of the biggest lies and just saddest lies that was told in 2016 is when Trump and the entire Republican Party talked about these jobs that will not be back because of technology and automation.
Right.
How do you have that conversation with Americans, both in the Midwest and on the coast, who might not have wrapped their head around it? You know, Hillary Clinton was criticized for saying that these jobs won't be back. I'm sorry, but no one truly listened to, you know, her ideas about maybe educating these workers and bringing them into the 21st century, 21st century jobs. How do you want to talk about that, or how would you suggest any Democrat talk about that when you know what's going to be coming from the other side?
It's a great question. I think Democrats really need to find a voice on this that is honest, but also reaches people where they are. So one of the problems I found with our party is sometimes we viewed somebody who's displaced in the economy as being kind of broken, like we're going to come in and fix you. So we have these well-intentioned training programs. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I've helped sponsor some of these training programs in South Bend that do good. But if the message is, there's something wrong with you, we're going to come fix you, and then you're going to be happy in this identity, not just job, but identity that's completely different than what you're used to, we're only solving part of the problem. In other words, even if we can get somebody who's been disrupted out of one industry, a job in another one with an income to match, and that's not easy, but it can be done. We're not acknowledging the fact that a job is a lot more than an income, right? I mean, our job it's a source of meaning. It's how when you meet somebody at a party and they're trying to get to know who you are, they say, what do you do, right? It's how we explain where we fit in the world. And yet, belonging to a generation that is likely to change careers more often than our parents' generation changed jobs, we know that the workplace, the expectation of a lifelong relationship with a single employer just isn't there in the same way for us. And so it can't be the same source of identity or community or purpose that it used to be. What we did at home was we basically said, yeah, a lot of these ways of doing things are not coming back, but we are, and here's how. And it turned out that community itself can be a really good answer to that question of what fills the void of your identity if it's not coming from a lifelong role at a certain employer. That playing a role in the comeback of a city like ours, or the growth of a community like this that's got such an interesting trajectory, or some pursuits that we really want to encourage that help people draw meaning. And again, some of this sounds conservative. It can come from faith. It can come from family. But it doesn't always have to come from the workplace. Because the reality is those changes are only going to accelerate. And it's not just a blue-collar thing. CPAs, radiologists, not mayors yet, but there is a lot of automation coming to the white-collar world too. And so we've got to find a way to knit that together, because if we don't, then you'll see the ugliest forms of politics rushing in to fill the void. And I think we've seen some of that right now. I want to get some closer to the back. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mayor, welcome to Ankeny. Thank you for being here. You referenced a sleeper issue, possibly trying to identify some sleeper issues that people could agree on and actually do something with. Yep. I'm going to throw out one for your consideration, and that is the aging of America, which nobody talks about, but which they should be talking about. Yep. Actually, I shouldn't say that. We've been talking about this for a long, long time, but not doing anything. Yep. I take you 29 years ago was the first congressional commission that talked about the aging of America, the fact that we got all these people in this baby boom category, and they're going to get older, and they're probably going to live longer than they ever imagined, and they're going to need some help, and how are we going to do this, and how are we going to pay for this? That was 29 years ago. 10 years later, we had another congressional commission that said, you know, my God, we got all these people that are getting older, and we got baby boomers, and they're going to have some needs, and how are we going to pay for this? And then about 8 years later, we had another presidential commission, and guess what they said? The same thing. Yeah. So we've been talking about the aging of America for 29 years. We've identified all kinds of potential approaches to deal with the challenges that come along with aging. And I'm just asking if you will kind of put that on your radar, and if it's something that you've seen in your own perspective from a mayor's chair, and if you would make it a greater priority if you become president of the United States. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great question. And as somebody who's spoken a lot about generational issues, I think it makes tons of sense for us to explore those issues more. So thank you for raising those. You know, in short, a couple of things that I want to mention are out there that deserve attention. One is making sure we like, for example, when you have a conversation about technology and automation, it sometimes is presented like it's a conversation for the young. One of the most exciting things about the promise, the upside of automation, in the case, for example, of automated vehicles, is from a freedom perspective, in a country where driving equals freedom, and where for many people, aging to a certain point, loss of being able to drive means a loss of freedom. we may actually be able to enhance people's freedom by connecting them up to those resources that allow them to just have mobility in a way that wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. So understanding how those technological changes can redound to the benefit of people as they age is important. Of course, a lot of this is also a financial question, and it really is intergenerational because it's about the generation that's aging and then the generation of people who are assigned to take care of the generation that's aging. Again, it can be good news. If America can produce the goods and services it needs with fewer hours of work in industry, then Americans are freer to put more hours into something I call work, but is good, meaningful work that is not always compensated or accounted for on our books, like taking care of family members, whether we're talking about your kids or whether we're talking about your parents. And I think we have to have a national dialogue that values that work. Some of the more interesting proposals about basic income actually suggest that it be connected to that work. So I welcome your challenge to talk and think about those issues more deeply, and I'm really glad that you raised that. Thank you. Yes, straight in the back.
Thank you. What ideas do you have for how we might begin to address the student loan debt crisis that's crippling folks of both yours and my generation and preventing us from being able to reach our full economic potential, buy homes, have children?
Thank you. Yes, a huge issue. Student loans, if you didn't hear it. It's an issue in our household. We need this book I have coming out next week to do really well for many reasons, one of which has to do with student debt. And it is another example of something that I think diminishes the freedom of a new generation if you can't explore your passions and your pursuits because you're under this crushing load of student debt. There are some, in my view, comparatively obvious things that need to be looked at, like being able to refinance student debt the way you can refinance debt on your house. Seems pretty commonsensical. There's a cost to it, but it makes sense to me. Also expanding things like the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which in recent years has become really hard to access. I push because all the people who work for the city are public servants. We made sure that we connected them up with resources to access that benefit, but it's become hard to get to at the very moment when we would want to expand it. Same for teachers. If somebody's willing to work in a critically important, and let's face it, embarrassingly undercompensated profession like teaching, let's at the very least make sure that we buy down the debt that they incurred in order to become qualified to have that incredibly important job. So it needs attention, it needs resources, it needs political will, and whether we resolve that is one of the things that will decide whether our generation, frankly, becomes the first in American history to be worse off economically than our parents, or whether we become the one that unlocks the potential of this country even more than any that have come before us. Yes, sir.
Okay, question from the older generation.
Yeah.
I was drafted in 1964 during the Johnson administration, and Vietnam War was starting to heat up. Okay, luckily I was sent to Germany rather than to Vietnam. I was thankful for that.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was eligible for VA health care. And in 2012, I had successful colon cancer surgery here at the Des Moines VA.
Okay.
I got excellent care there. I can't say anything better about the VA than the Des Moines VA. But anyway, the president is talking about turning some of the VA health care over to private. What is your feeling on that?
I'm very concerned about that, especially because I don't believe, look, right now we've got a lot of agencies in government run by people who don't believe in government. And there are real consequences to that, from the VA to environmental protection. I understand and in some moments sympathize with the conservative impulse that wants government to do a better job. But if you just plain don't believe in it, then we have a problem, and I'm worried that that's what's motivating these conversations about the VA. Look, we know that there are challenges with the VA, especially when it comes to access, making sure more people access the benefits that they're entitled to, and when it comes to wait times. But I'm really glad to hear that you had a good experience there, and most of the people I served with have been well looked after as well.
I want to make sure that all the veterans coming after me have that same good care.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, that's what intergenerational justice looks like, right? I mean, some of the people who have responded most powerfully, I think, to this idea of paying attention to the relationship between generations is people who served, and thank you for serving, by the way, and who want to make sure that this country is in good hands for the generations to come. So thank you for serving, and thank you for raising that issue. Yes?
Yeah, One of the issues, again, being from the Jewish community, is separation of church and state.
Yeah.
And as the president, how would you talk, so you both talk to the religious right and to the liberal left, to say that you are both going to protect people from imposing their religious views on one, such as the Baker issue, and such as the Hobby Lobby, and but also you're going to protect their rights, but you also need to protect the other religious, the non-religious rights.
Yeah, I mean, true religious freedom, in my view, means the ability to be treated the same whether you were of any faith or no faith. And that's how our country got started. So I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this, especially coming up in Mike Pence's Indiana.
My condolences.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just leave it right there. It is really important, especially at a moment when we are experiencing a lot of religious intolerance. And it's being visited upon the heads of Americans who are being made to feel less of that sense of belonging we were talking about. When America's magic has to do with the fact that it can accommodate people of all faiths and of no faith. So it's very important for me, as somebody who is religious but understands that I have no business imposing that or assigning that to anybody else. But also as somebody whose life has been shaped and at some moments made more vulnerable by people who decided that they wanted to impose their interpretation of their religion in a way that made it harder for me. And I just don't understand it, to be honest. I mean, that's just not a policy debate. It's a debate with my fellow Christians about what Christianity ought to look like. Because the Christianity I study has an awful lot to do with comforting prisoners and welcoming strangers and lifting up the poor. But that's for another debate. The bottom line is the people who built America were believers in religious pluralism even before they figured out the democracy part. Right? We hit on democracy in the 18th century, but we were doing religious pluralism in the 17th century. And that's something, if you don't have that, I don't know that this is America anymore. So.
Let me give you this. It's a plan to solve the tuition crisis I presented to a Senate subcommittee back in 2009. It never went anywhere.
Well, thank you. All right. If you figured it out, then more power to you. I look forward to learning that. Yes, here.
Another freedom issue is reproductive freedom.
Yes.
And in Iowa especially, and I know you've had that in Indiana, but it seems like we're moving backwards, and obstacle after obstacle is being created in the legislature here in Iowa to take away the rights of women to have jurisdiction over their own bodies.
Yeah.
And now we have a couple more right-wing judicial Supreme Court justices that are going to possibly make the attempt to overturn Roe v. Wade, and that's what a lot of people, religious right individuals in Iowa, want to see happen. What are your thoughts on that issue, and how do women and girls gain back the freedom to have control over their own bodies?
Yeah. Thank you for raising that. And you're right, Indiana and Iowa are very much in the same boat on this issue. I mean, restriction has been piled upon restriction. And when you want to talk about freedom, this has diminished the freedom of so many people in our states and in our country. My belief is pretty simple, which is that this is a very difficult, challenging decision that a woman has to make with the guidance of her doctor. And the last person who belongs in the middle of that decision is a male government official or politician like me. And yes, if people can't get the results they want in the democratic process, then they look to the judiciary to do it. And that's what's happening right now. This fight will move to the courts. But those appointments, of course, come back to the democratic process. And that's why it's important, if we care about this issue, to support people who support that kind of freedom and we'll appoint justices accordingly. So thank you. Saw a hand way in the back.
Hi, how are you doing? I have two questions that are unrelated. My first question is, in 2016, about halfway through the primary, a little after halfway through, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders met, and I don't know what happened inside, but I know what didn't happen. What didn't happen is that they didn't form a coalition, they didn't run together, and we are where we are now. If you were lucky enough or blessed enough to be in a similar situation, would you consider a coalition with a competitor over a, I'm going to win, so I'm going to keep going? Second question is, what do you, what's your definition of Medicare for all?
Great. First, I want to pause to express my admiration for your T-shirt. I just think that deserves comment. So I'll take the second one first. So to me, Medicare for all means everybody is covered by insurance. And by the way, I want to assert something here because I think the politics around this issue got way out of whack. The furthest right position you can have on healthcare is that it should be completely market-based, free for all, corporate only, with no government involvement. If we're taking the, to its logical extreme, the position of the right. One could similarly argue that the position to the left, if you were all the way on the left, would be full government-run socialized medicine. The position in the middle is that we have private medicine, but it's paid for by public insurance to make sure literally everybody is insured. So it's time to stop calling that centrist compromise position some kind of newfangled crazy far left idea and recognize that for the compromise that it is.
Yeah. Medicare right now is a hybrid.
Yeah.
It's Part C provides private access to the Medicare pool. So do you envision, if we were to address our healthcare problem with a Medicare for all, that it would follow that path of a hybrid public-private insurance?
Potentially. So I'm not one of those who believes we need to systematically eradicate any private involvement in our healthcare system. I look at Medicare itself, right, where you can have a Medicare Advantage plan, you can have a supplemental plan, you can insure against copays or deductibles. We can talk about, obviously I'm giving simple expressions around a very complex part of the economy and part of our lives. But my appreciation for Medicare just went through the roof because of a very challenging family experience we have that we lost my father recently. And during his illness, we had to make some very challenging decisions, and it was a very hard time for our family. But all we had to think about was what was right for our family and what was right for him medically. And thank God we weren't also thinking about the finances of the family and whether they would be able to survive financially while we made the right medical choices. And when I say thank God, what I really mean is thank good policymakers for the existence of Medicare. And I believe all Americans ought to enjoy that. So we can talk about different structures to get there. I think a pathway there could be Medicare for all who want it and kind of going down the road of making it available as a kind of public option that people gradually buy into. And then if people like me are right that it's a good option, then that's how we graduate to a world where it really is the single payer. But that's where I come at it from. Your other question, oh yes, well, I'll just say it now. I plan to support the Democratic nominee in 2020, period. Someone at and if there's a way to...
Had they run together,
yeah,
that would have brought the two parts of the party that were...
Yeah. Yeah, and I believe in the possibility of forming a coalition in advance, too. I mean, you never know exactly how it's going to shake out. But the bottom line is we got to come together. I want to make sure I get folks who haven't had a chance to ask first. Yes, sir.
As a 1971 combat vet, Vietnam, what are your thoughts on the veteran VA situation? I'm glad our brother got taken care of.
Yeah.
But as a DAV service officer and as the president, Iowa Democratic Veteran Caucus chair, the health care in the state of Iowa for veterans with mental health issues in closing mental health facilities, and with a suicide rate of 22 a day, it's hard for veterans to put their their families around the fact that America respects their service. Thank you for your service. What does that mean? How far are we, or what do we mean when someone says to me, thank you for your service? I say, what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
How far will you go? See, I went all the way for you. I'm disabled. What will you do for us? And with the new program that was started last November, which is RAMP, is called Rapid Appeals Modernization Program, to replace the past program for VA claims. It has a devastating part of it where you have to sign a legal form to give up your right to appeal VA's decision. And that is going to be law February of this year, the 19th. How embarrassing can a country be to ask you to defend them, to risk your life, and then not provide health care? I'm glad our brother was taken care of, and I look forward to our sisters being taken care of. But in this state and across the country, we are 400,000 claims behind now. 400,000. Should that be a priority? It bounced around. You hear it all the time.
Right.
I support the troops.
Right.
You talk to people that are running for office, I support the troops. But the facts is that we're 400,000 claims and going the other way.
Right.
And RAMP is supposed to fix this, and RAMP has, anybody with a cell phone's got it in their back pocket. Rapid Appeals Modernization Program. You have to give up your right to qualify for an appeals process. I don't think anybody in this room would give up their right to an appeal on anything.
Yeah.
And yet, we're asking our disabled veterans to sign that right away.
Well, thank you for raising that, and I agree. I mean, anybody can say thank you for your service, but how do we go about saying it? And if somebody was, to me, this is not a benefit in the sense of being a gift. This is America keeping a promise. People raise their right hand and put their lives on the line for this country, and America has to keep its end of the bargain. I'm especially glad you mentioned the mental health side of things, because that's, I think, where we're most deficient. And you may have seen there's an epidemic of suicides in parking lots of VA facilities by people who have been let down by the system. It will not be fixed overnight, but it demands resources more than we have. And I wasn't aware of this feature of the RAMP process that you were talking about, and I'm going to go to school on that because that's extremely concerning.
And I don't want to be down on all the American people, because God bless the ones that are out there fighting for us every day and working in our VA facilities. I'm there all the time. We take veterans down, and they're great people. I'm not downtrodden the individuals whatsoever.
Yeah.
But the system, as 80% of the American people believe that veterans and military families are being taken care of.
Yeah.
And
Can I just say something else on the theme of conversation between generations? That when I came back from Afghanistan, people were standing at the airport and cheering and clapping, and there were balloons. And it's very hard for me to think about the idea that I might have been in that situation at a time when America had not figured out how to separate the way it feels about a policy from the way it feels about the troops who were sent to carry out that policy. We've tried to put that right in South Bend with a much, much belated welcome home ceremony we do with our Vietnam vets, but I just want to let you know on behalf of a generation of vets that was treated much better than yours was, that whether you're drafted or whether you're rogered up. I'm sorry that happened. And
dealt with one of our promises to your generation is never again will one generation of veterans leave another generation left behind. But with the new RAMP program, we had a veteran in Arizona file a claim through RAMP. And he was thinking, I need the money, I need this income. And when he filed the claim, it was set up on television. He was afraid of that. You know, wow, there's technology. I said they do it all the time. It's just the way it is. We can't, you know, we got to move on with it. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock. At 9:30, the veteran was in the office. At 9:45, we were notified that his claim was denied. And I said, how can that be? You know, and they said, the claim's not till 10 o'clock. They said, under RAMP, we can have the hearing anywhere we want. And we can decide who's going to be there. And this hearing was held in Texas. This is documented. This hearing was held in Texas. And his claim was denied.
Wow.
I don't think we're taking care of our veterans.
Okay. Would you be able, is Stephen still within earshot? I would love if one of my team members could follow up with you just to get a little more about
That's why
the details
they
there.
called me and told me you were going to be here.
Terrific.
And so as the
Great.
chair of the Iowa Democratic Veteran Caucus.
Terrific. Thanks.
why
I'd
I'm
love your help getting more educated on some of what the experience has been here. Thank you for that. Yes.
You've spoken obviously about our democracy and how much we need to focus on the things that maybe weaken our democracy. And another one that I think is really important is the incredibly low rates of participation in our democracy.
Yes.
You know, as shown in turnout rates across the country. And I think sometimes at the local level, one thing that bolsters those rates is that people know you as the candidate, and they know you as a friendly face. They know what you stand for, and they know how genuine you are. But I'm wondering, if you were elected president, what you think that the president could do to set the tone, especially as a young president, for how important it is that, or what policy changes could be made to increase participation in our democracy.
Yeah, thank you. The question, if you didn't hear, is about participation in our democracy. And you're right, it's critically important along the other things we talked about when it comes to democracy. I think there's some very specific policy measures we can take right away that would make it easier. In fact, right now we're working on a measure to give our city workforce more time off in order for them to vote and take advantage of early voting. There is no constitutional basis for election day to be on a Tuesday. It had to do with being able to ride your horse in and then get to market in time for Wednesday. Pretty safe to say that's no longer the most relevant consideration for timing our elections. Maybe it would make sense to have it on a weekend. Maybe we do it on a Saturday. Maybe out of regard for the Jewish community and the Christian community, we have it from noon to noon, Saturday to Sunday. Maybe we just make Election Day a holiday. Whatever we do, and what really scares, forgive me for being a little partisan here, but I couldn't help but notice the Senate, the senator talking about how Election Day being a holiday was a power grab by our party. I would think that if more people voting is bad for your party, there's something wrong with your party. So I think it's time for us to do something about that, and we can definitely be making it easier, not harder right now. Yes, sorry.
You talked about taking money out of politics. What policies have you seen, like state level or used to exist federally, that you would want to try and implement to try and get money out?
Well, first of all, Citizens United, I think, was a disaster for our democracy. Now, that was a court decision, not a piece of legislation, and that was an interpretation of the Constitution. Maybe we need to clarify the Constitution to say that dollars shouldn't have the same rights as people, and that corporations shouldn't either. And to people who say it's way too pie in the sky to talk about anything that would involve changing the Constitution, first of all, my home state senator 50 years ago was cranking out amendments, some that didn't make it, like the Equal Rights Amendment, some that did, like getting the voting age changed. Of course we can adjust the Constitution to make sure that we're a more democratic society. This is a country that changed the Constitution so you couldn't drink, and then realized that was a bad idea and changed it back. So why wouldn't we contemplate, at least contemplate, a considered decision as a country to let the Constitution put the rights of people above the rights of dollars? So that's the fundamental thing. Now, I will acknowledge that that's not something you could do overnight or even in one presidential term. And that's all right, because we got to start somewhere. I do think that models like some of the clean elections law models you see in states like Arizona can have an impact. I think while it is not politically convenient to talk about funding, it can be twisted into funding politicians. Frankly, public funding makes a lot of sense because of the fairness that it can create. I think we got to have greater transparency around who gives what, who, and why. And I think the patchwork of campaign finance laws that we have across the states is a real problem. So there's no one policy silver bullet for this. But I think and the other thing, by the way, is just voters need to hold elected officials accountable for whether they make choices that increase or decrease the influence of money in politics. And that's something we could be doing right away. Yes?
On the subject of holding politicians accountable, one of the things that I find very important is honesty and transparency about the decisions that candidates make in their personal lives. So we know the media obviously shows all of the workings of, I guess, I don't want to quote dirty details of the Republican politicians, be it through rape culture or racial bias or straight up discrimination. But we also have to hold our Democratic politicians accountable as well. I'm going to bring up Al Franken of Minnesota and his abhorrent treatment of women, and also the current governor and vice governor of Virginia. The vice governor was recent news, but for those who don't know, the governor of Virginia admitted to wearing blackface. Not necessarily in the picture that was first shown, but he admitted to actually wearing blackface in general. And the vice governor of Virginia admitted to sexually assaulting.
Yeah, I think he hasn't admitted it, but he's been accused. And I think as of today, he's been credibly accused more than once.
Sorry, I misheard.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is there are allegations between both of them.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other Democratic candidates who probably have their own, quote, dirty details.
Yeah.
So how do you go about that? How does a Democratic Party that says we are not the Republican Party and the Republican Party is known for this and has politicians that do this, this, and this, and then have politicians that do similar things?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is I think, and I don't mean to congratulate ourselves because we've got our issues to work through too, but I would point to the contrast between how the Democratic Party handled allegations of sexual mistreatment among people in our ranks. For example, you're talking about an ex-senator, and I think you're talking about a soon-to-be ex-governor and ex-lieutenant governor, and what's going on the other side of the aisle. Or when it comes to these disturbing racial revelations, the difference between the conversation the Democratic Party is having about the governor of Virginia, and I'm sorry, but the conversation, if any, that the Republican Party is having about people like Steve King, right? How much will we tolerate? That is one of the things that ultimately gets resolved by the conduct of a primary process and a campaign process. But also, I think that people of conscience need to look at the right thing to do, and I think that'll resolve some of these issues too. So thank you. I'm getting the high sign that we're at 2. Does that mean 2 minutes or 2 questions? 2 questions. All right. As long as they're 1 minute each, I guess. Yes.
Recently, I read a news story about a crack in one of our dams, and kind of leads to the question: we have a lot of infrastructure that's aging past its prime, way past its prime, and it's going to start to be a problem for a lot of people in our generation because we're going to have to start fixing all of this stuff. I guess kind of what is your plan for an infrastructure week or something like that?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I wasn't aware about the dam issue. I want to learn more about that. But, you know, a mayor is the keeper of a lot of infrastructure. And by the way, there are parts, when we hear infrastructure, we think about a lot of things that excite, I think, a lot of us. They're kind of sexy things, you know, airports and bullet trains, and that stuff needs attention. A lot of the most important infrastructure is things like dams, stuff that's underground, water and wastewater. It's not sexy, but try living just 1 minute without it. And I think that's one thing the mayors are very attuned to. In our city, for example, we will have to spend somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion. So that could be $10,000 for every man, woman, and child in a city where the per capita income has only just now broken above $20,000, just to upgrade our sewer infrastructure. So these issues are tremendously important, and they can't just be left to the states and cities to figure out on our own. I think the idea of a national infrastructure bank is very promising and ought to be taken seriously. I think we also just need to mount a major investment, much as we have had at other key moments in American history, to take our infrastructure to the other level, because our competitors on the world stage are way ahead of us on this. I mean, let's take trains. You know, it doesn't have to be the only way we get around, but imagine what it would mean for the Midwest if places like Des Moines and Chicago and South Bend and Louisville and Cincinnati and Detroit were networked by a much more robust high speed. I'm not even asking for high speed. I'm asking for what would be considered regular speed in many parts of the world. All right? We can aspire to have a Japanese level later, but if we just had an Italian or an English level, we'd be better than we are today. And that would unlock huge potential, especially in the industrial Midwest. So I hope that we can move in that direction, and I think we need some political will to make those investments. I think we got time for one last question. I see a hand up way straight in the back.
Along with expanding democracy that you've been talking about, what are your thoughts on the filibuster in the Senate? Because it seems like it would be impossible to get most progressive legislation with 60 votes. Is there, do you think that should be changed, or how would you get legislation?
I think it needs to be on the table. I don't have the final answer. I'm obviously not even in the Senate, but I think, look, sometimes, I want to say this carefully, because on one hand, it means something that we are more respectful of rules and institutions than our friends on the other side. And we don't want to become what we are opposed to. On the other hand, sometimes, you know, on things like the filibuster on judicial nominees, I mean, there have been a lot of matters, whether it's rules issues in the Senate or just the practice of our politics in general, where it's like Lucy holding the football and Charlie Brown thinking this time he's going to get to kick the football, and then she pulls it away at the last minute. The sense of fair play is not shared right now. And so we need to find a way to retain our integrity and at the same time be ready to fight back when we are being taken advantage of by a party that, especially in the Senate, has become exquisitely attuned and focused on the exercise of power. So much so that sometimes I wonder if they're pursuing power for its own sake, just because they became good at it. We got to change that. And that might mean taking rules that we've hewed to for a long time and reconsidering them. But we got to do it in a process that is well considered, that is well thought through, that is inclusive, where we state our reasons for doing it. And we got to believe that really is the right thing to do for the country. I'm not there yet, but I think it's got to be on the table. Again, thank you so much for being here. If you're interested in keeping in touch with our campaign, PeteForAmerica.com, or talk to one of our friendly team members here. And I very much hope this is not the last time I'll get to see you. Thank you. Yeah, read it. Maybe moving away from old models is not a bad thing right now, so thank you.
Anyway, thank you. Mayor, I want to make sure you get to see Representative Ned.
Oh, hey, how are you? Good to see you in
again.
person.
Thank you very much.
How's everything going? I know it's high season for you all. What's going on?
It's 4 weeks into the legislature, so far so good, and it's just been crazy what we're seeing. A lot of kind of crazy stuff happening as far as our judicial nomination process, which has been a model for the nation. Very nonpartisan, and right now the House and the Senate are both trying to pass through a bill that changes the nominating commissions so that they are chosen by partisan elected leaders instead of by nonpartisan juries. So
you're standing up saying we should make this process more partisan.
Yes, and then the other thing is a constitutional amendment basically to say that there is no right to abortion.
Right, I saw that. Yeah.
So there's a lot of that stuff happening, but I'm hopeful that we can do some other things in education, hopefully some healthcare and some economics.
It's a good thing you're there.
Come around this way.
Let us know how to be helpful. Really excited for it.
I don't know if you
okay.
And I don't know if you met my husband Chris.
Oh no,
when
I'm
we were
sorry.
at
Hi,
Riverside
nice to see you.
Alliance.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Would it be okay to get a picture?
Of course, I'd be honored.
Yes, thank you.
Here, why don't you get the little... Karen, you get it?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you for
Keep in
being
touch.
here.
Let us know your things. Of course, I'm honored to be here. Hey, nice meeting you. Which ones am I supposed to? Yeah, just tell me which ones. All of them except the.
I'm Mary Maloney, the Polk County Treasurer. My daughter went to school. That's awesome.
Really? So you know South
My condolences on your death. I had seen an email that Notre Dame sent out, and I said, well, so it's got to be the same thing.
Yeah, there's not too many folks with that name in Indiana.
No.
Yeah, no, it was tough. Also, people were amazing, and I've met a bunch of these former students who kind of come out of the woodwork. Yeah, and just learned about all these lives.
Karen, are you going to
It's almost, I'm an only child, but I feel like
But he can stay in
yeah, she is. Yeah, she's doing well.
Well, he must have been proud of you.
You know, he lived to see the announcement of the exploratory, and when I saw him the next day, it was all he wanted to talk about. We lost him the next weekend, but I'm glad he got to see that.
My condolences. And good to see you.
Same here. Go ahead.
Yeah, here.
Oh, yeah,
Sure.
All right. One sec, we're just going to take off the mics, and then we're good for photos, okay? Got it.
My husband's name is Pete.
Is that right? It's a good name. Tell him I said hi. All right.
Hey, while you're taking off the mic, can you just say hello to Brad Hummer? He's in Indiana.
Oh, sure. All right. I can shout out Brad Hummer in Indiana. Wish you were here with us. I think the Vice one is the one that stays.
Yeah, leave on the smaller one. Leave that one. Yep, leave that one.
Learning what it's like to be a Christmas tree.
I actually lived in Fort Wayne for 20 years.
I know Indiana well then.
Oh, good stuff. I got a lot of friends there. Dave Beckman.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too. Thank you. Heard a lot about you.
All right, I think that's the one that stays.
All right, pull him down.
Maybe I should really
I was texting Brad while I was in the back. I go, this guy's amazing. Very impressive. It's going to be a lot of candidates.
It's a good thing. I think the more the merrier, you know, I mean, we'll have a robust.
Are you comfortable on this big stage?
Thank you.
This growing stage? This is my wife Karen back here.
I'm not sure which one's yours.
Nice to see you. Same here. Thanks a lot for coming. Appreciate it.
All right,
Let's go in the middle here.
Oh, what a family. He's going on the essay social.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you again.
Congratulations. Picture. How are you? Thank you so much. Good luck. Good luck.
How you doing? Good. Thanks for coming down. Looking forward to having you back.
Thanks. We'll be along.
Thank
you so much for coming.
I appreciate it.
Mayor, she drove from 40 miles away.
Oh gosh. Wow.
Yeah,
Thanks for making the trip in the cold and everything.
Well, I wanted to get a chance to get to see you in person, so I really appreciate you coming and taking time to answer some questions. Yes, certainly. Good luck to you.
I talked to Mike Shaw about donating some money campaign. Card. He'll take care of it.
Thank you. Really appreciate the support there.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for joining. I appreciate it.
Nice to see you again. I met you
was it Progress IO?
Yeah, good to see you. We're glad to see you back again.
Thanks. Good to be back.
Thanks so much.
Don't mind you got the
yeah, we have to drink a lot now, so get through it. But yeah, take care.
Hi.
Hello. Thanks for your questions.
No, thank you for answering that.
I want a selfie of us.
Yeah.
I'm glad you raised that. Belonging, I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely interested in helping out.
Good,
So.
good. I appreciate it. Need all the help we can get, so thank you so much. Hi.
Thank you for coming.
Sure thing. Thanks for having us. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for running.
That one's you?
Yep. Thank you. That one you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Excuse me.
All right. Thank you again. Appreciate it. Hi. Thanks for joining.
Sarah, thank you. Yeah, I'm Rosie.
Nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm Abby.
How are you?
Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. See you again. Thanks for being here. Yeah. Oops. Picture time, all right? Thanks. Appreciate it. What you got?
You had a great answer.
Oh, good. It's a tricky question. It's challenging. There's no easy answer. Right, we'll take it too. Thank you so much. I'm glad you raised it. Appreciate it. Thank you. Hello.
Hello, and nice to meet you.
Same here. Thanks for coming.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Thanks for being here. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Hello. All right. Well, we welcome the public support too, so hopefully I can win you over. I mean, look, I think we can find a common sense direction, but I also think that it's been, it's been the most divisive elements of this kind of been lifted up for the purpose of the right. I think those freedoms away. I just don't view myself as the judge of some of these issues. I think no doctor, I've never met a doctor who would do the wrong thing in that situation. But I'm from Indiana and I have friends and people I believe in and view it differently.
But the big term, does that not make a distinction here? I think it does. I think it's a deal breaker.
I respect it.
I don't know that one is really
Same here. Thanks for taking time. Oh, is that right?
So I was really interested to research.
Yeah, wish him well, and thanks. That means you're supporting the country in a way too, so thank you. It asks a lot of our parents. Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. Hi.
It's going to be a group of us.
Nice to see you. Oh, hey. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I actually came there. Thank you.
What a delight to get to know you. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Appreciate it.
You may not know, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the same-sex marriage ruling in Iowa this year.
Oh, goodness.
And I'm on the board of One Iowa, and we have our gala April 12th. And it's going to be a huge celebration.
Hopefully, you need to make sure. I would love to be there.
I know we're going to send an invite
Please
to
do.
your
Yeah, no, I'd love a
so
chance
we'd
just to
love
thank the
have you.
people who blazed the trail for, we're enjoying those freedoms in a very personal way, and I know they didn't come easy.
Very moving to have you here. I agree with your statement about you would have never thought you could be out in politics at the same time.
Or for that matter, that you can be married or at all. So, thank you.
So
I asked you the question, the very unsexy question about aging.
Yes, I think it's really wise to move that process.
Public policy opportunity there, a huge political opportunity there too, quite frankly, but somebody needs to go down.
No, it's a great point. In fact, one of my mentors as well as David Pryor, I think, chaired that first committee that you were talking about, one of those in that sequence that you mentioned. And it's such an important issue. I think one of the reasons it's gone down the way you talked about is that it's resisted easy answers, right? But it's an area that requires way more attention just as a framework for some of our
You can only
policies.
study things for so long. I mean, it's like
I just got to do something.
so much of problem solving is about, I think it was, I can't remember who said this, but we'll solve problems when the plane crashes. And we're waiting for this plane to crash, and it's a slow motion plane crash. This cries out for leadership.
Especially because we see it coming, so shame on us if we don't
Well, let's
figure
get
it
a
out.
quick picture if we can.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure seeing you.
Nice to meet you. I think it's really awesome that you're coming. And
Well, if people are this nice to me, I'll come back often.
it's Iowa nice, right?
I love it.
Thank you for coming.
Same here, and thank you for your question. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your answer.
I enjoyed the opportunity.
Like I say, I'm concerned about veterans that follow me.
Yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. I know, and that's what I found. I mean, especially as a younger candidate, I find that folks who are my parents or grandparents' age really care the most about what's going to happen to young people.
I was really impressed. You're like a Kennedy.
Well, I don't know about that, but
for my generation, I'm a big John Kennedy.
Yeah. Well, that was somebody who really called everybody to public service in a way to believe that politics could be a noble thing.
Right, exactly. And it doesn't seem like that anymore.
Yeah. So we got to do that.
Republic is what I downplay.
Right. Well, and could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So,
But anyway, thanks for coming.
Same here. Thank you.
Come back.
We'll do.
Hi, I'm Meredith. Nice to meet you. I saw you spoke at Georgetown.
Yes.
About a year and a half ago when I was working there. I know you went back.
Was that when I was there with a couple other mayors?
Exactly.
Yeah, that was a fun
amazing
panel. Yeah, it's good. Very bipartisan group.
Now I'm working in the legislature for State Senator Amanda Reagan, who's the Democratic whip, and I was her campaign manager.
Wow.
So,
I know it's wild times in the legislature right now, so thanks for what you're doing.
So,
it's a tough environment.
Yes, absolutely.
So much, people don't realize how much power there is in the legislature. People can get away with murder.
I mean, you just have the full range of political views here, I think. So, it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, very much so.
But yeah, I'm just working 4 days a week, and I'd love to volunteer for you guys.
Thank you. Yeah, have you connected one of your team members yet? Okay, let's make sure, Max, let's make sure that we connect so that she can help. She wants to be involved too. We'd love to rope you in. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Of course.
There, this is Chairman Healy, the chair of the Veterans Party.
Thanks for what you do.
And you'll see him tomorrow morning as well at the State Central Committee. He's on the State Central.
Right, I have. I'd be proud if you would wear.
Awesome. Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm going to take a photo for you.
Sure.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Is that right? Thanks. See you in the morning.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Look forward to it as well.
And your UAW as well.
Yes, that's kind of guy with a million hats.
Oh, that's great. I cut my teeth trying to. Yeah, I got into politics because of the guy that the Indiana treasurer is trying to block the Chrysler rescue, and so I spent a year running for treasurer. I didn't get very far politically, but I went to UAW halls, retiree chapters all over the state. That was just the backbone of our operation. So I came to really admire what you all do.
Well, it's been a real big struggle, but the struggle with veterans is just incredible. What's going on with the veterans community?
I look forward to learning more about some of the things you brought up too, because I didn't go to school on that.
Yeah, like I said, it's what I've done for. Well, the UAW has been instrumental in giving me the opportunity to do that with our national organization, with our UAW veterans. So, plus Dennis Williams, our past president, just retired, was really instrumental in his leadership, giving us the opportunity to do what we do for veterans and learn. I mean, we not only work with veterans, we're constantly educating ourselves so that we can.
And then you can advocate for people navigating through the system too. So.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for taking that on, and I'll see you in the morning.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Hello.
Hey, nice to meet you. Thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my name's Alex. I wanted to get a picture with Chatham
the real
as
star.
well because my cousin Kathy was in your guys' wedding.
This is Kathy's cousin. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I've been hearing about you for a while.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Do you like that?
Yeah,
Well,
we'll
great.
take
We
a
got to
photo.
send her a picture of it.
Yeah.
Is this your phone?
She's a character.
Okay, so we'll swap.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow. When you talk to
just
him,
in
say
there.
what I keep in contact with Kathy, so.
I just thought that was hilarious.
Oh, neat. Oh, that's so great. Tell her we said hi.
Great job.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm getting out of your photos now.
There you go.
Thank you. That's fun.
All right, sounds good. Hey, Mr. Mayor, thanks for coming. We like that you're here in Iowa. We like what you had to say, so
thank you.
Like the rollout video, and look forward to seeing more of you. Yeah, I think he has my phone. Do you mind doing a picture quick? Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you, and she's gonna be next, actually.
Great. Okay. Awesome.
I'm really excited to see you. And thanks for seeing more.
Well, the welcome's been fantastic. So
Good.
Keep coming back. People are just nice to me. I'll keep coming back.
That's right. You're used to the weather, aren't you?
Hi, Mayor. I'm Amanda Porter. Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for coming, and I really enjoyed your talk that you did with the Atlantic. I listened to that.
Oh, wow.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I was bummed I couldn't be there, but glad I got to
Yeah, no, it was a really neat event. It was a good group of people.
Thanks for your attention, Mayor.
Oh, sure thing. No, I'm glad to be part of it. Doing a picture?
Yes,
Great.
please. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one. Do you want to go this way?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for being here.
Hi.
Thank you, Joy.
I'm pleasure to be here. My name's Julie. This is my husband Dave. Just want to meet you and tell you how impressed I am. What a breath of fresh air this is. We've been just lining up a stretch of candidates that we've looked at from the last, and we just needed something different. And this is so cool.
Well, if nothing else, I think I'll have something different.
Well, but that's good. But also, just just on a quick note, we both work supporting data systems that are systems that support agencies that serve people that are experiencing homelessness. And so affordable housing issues are huge for us. Wealth inequality, universal living wage, guaranteed income. Those are big issues, and absolutely.
It's such a challenge where we are, and the data is half the battle. Though,
well,
being able to
and
understand
and our
who's
data
in
shows
what
us
situation.
that although mental health and substance use are issues in the homeless population, at least in Iowa, even at our top, we're only 30% of the population.
Really?
70% of the population is in economic crisis. They
But you
can't
touched
afford
on
where
it.
they
I mean,
live.
so many problems are
When you don't
issues.
have, that research on the $400, people who are that close to just completely having
And
the bottom
we have the information now. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, just put out $15.03 in Iowa. That's what it takes.
That's how they've computed what a living wage would be.
And we know it. So it's not. This isn't. We're not in a vacuum anymore. We don't. It's not like, well, I wonder what that would be.
We don't have to
know that,
speculate on what
But the other piece that I wanted to touch on too is just this issue around the idea of if we can craft some solid policy, because in Iowa, a session before last, we had two. Iowa's a home rule state, but we had two counties in Iowa that actually raised their minimum wages locally to $12 or $13 an hour.
Really?
The Iowa
They'd never let me do that in Indiana.
The Iowa legislature in the next session took that away.
Can you imagine coming together to make sure people get paid less?
They said the rules were too confusing.
Did it take effect, or did they block it before it took effect? Because if it took effect, there'd be no going back, right? People would know that that was making life better in that county.
But they didn't get, and that's why they didn't, but it's too confusing for business.
You didn't run into Matt Sullivan at college, did you?
It's kind of a familiar name. Would have been my year?
He
A
was
couple years
probably-
younger.
You would have probably crossed him before. So,
He's a friend of our son's, but anyway.
Oh, okay. All right.
Anyway, welcome to Iowa.
Thank you.
And really appreciate hearing what you have to say.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, your authenticity really comes through.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. My name's Logan.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
All right, glad to be here. Everybody's so nice to me. I'm gonna keep coming back.
Yeah, I have to say I'm such a fan that you're a huge policy nerd. Like Vox is like one of my favorite things.
Oh,
And just
yeah?
like listening, I'm like, oh, this is just like a Weeds episode. It's great.
Well, that's great. No, I think people are ready for that. I think people are more prepared to hear about policy than they get credit for. But I think the challenge is our party. We leap into the policy before we go over the values that motivate our policy. And I actually think the right's pretty good at talking about their values or their philosophical principles. And we go straight to the policy. So I think if we do it, kind of put the horse before the cart like we're supposed to, we might get Are you a student? Or,
So I actually just graduated from the University of Iowa this past May.
Congrats.
Worked on the Hubble campaign this past cycle, and then now I'm clerking for a state senator.
Oh wow, good stuff.
Yeah.
Good.
But back to when you were talking about your comment about values. Have you read Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind?
No, I've heard about it, and I'd like
Fantastic. I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah, no, you're right. That should go on my list. It's been precious little time for reading lately, but I gotta take some nourishment.
Audiobook, there we go.
Yeah, no, you have to, especially in this kind of rhythm of politics. You got to read well in order to speak well and think clearly.
Do you have a book that you personally felt like really changed your idea of policy? Or that how your way of thinking about politics?
My way of thinking of politics largely comes from novels, actually. So for me, it's like Joyce, Portrait of the Artist, Ulysses, because they're about, they touch policy in these very oblique ways, but it's really about why policy matters, which is how it affects everyday life. They're about just what it's like to be alive. And then you think about policy through that. Same with the Cairo trilogy of Mahfouz. And, it's about politics, but it's not really about politics, and it kind of fuses that. The most hair-raising thing I've read lately is The Fifth Risk. Have you read this?
I have. Is that the one about the Obama staffer?
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
You would appreciate this. It's about people in a federal government with unbelievable levels of responsibility that you've never heard of. Like the guy who spends $1 trillion over 10 years feeding people. He's an obscure official at the USDA who runs a school lunch program. Or people at the Department of Energy who are in charge of things like, nuclear weapons not going off when they're not supposed to. And it's incredibly important work that is unsung, and now they're under the direction of political appointees who are hostile to the idea of government itself. And it's talking about how there are these real consequences to it. But Michael Lewis is a very lively writer who can take these abstruse things and make them really,
I've
really
heard
pop.
really good things about that.
Yeah, you should definitely. It sounds like you would really appreciate that.
And of course, yours is going to be next on my list.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I should have thought to recommend my own book. I'm still learning to be that kind of author.
No, okay, don't worry. I will definitely help you pay off those student loans. Well,
All right,
one book at a time.
Appreciate it. Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Obligatory picture.
Let's do it.
Pottery.
Great.
Thank you so much. It was so nice
See you
meeting
on the
you.
trip.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thank you. It's almost dead. So.
Okay. Really quick.
Hi.
How are you?
My name is Shannon.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming and speaking to everybody.
Of course.
I'm also Heather Matson's clerk, so I just want to say that we love you. She loves you.
I'm so proud of her.
Yeah.
It's so great.
She's like, I had a phone call with him and it was freaking awesome. I was like, great.
Well, that's so nice to hear. Thanks for doing that.
Well,
Folks
thank
don't
you so
realize how important what's going on in the state legislatures.
Yeah,
is
exactly.
right now.
And how much they affect. Like, if you want anything fixed, it's not your president, it's your direct, local official.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you for
That's
coming
great.
out.
Same here. Thanks for being here. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for
name's
coming. Maddie, Pete. Good to see you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for coming.
Oh, there you go. Nice meeting you. Take care. Hey, I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to say I'm a social worker from Nebraska.
Oh, great.
Some of my kids that I work with haven't even heard about you.
Really?
So I just want to say thanks so much for being a positive role model for LGBT people. So, hey, thanks so much.
Sure thing.
Good to meet you.
Take care. You're doing an interview? Nice to meet you. Oh, okay. Nice to meet you. I'm Jeff. I'm the vice chair of the Yankee Democrats.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for what you're doing here.
Oh,
really
yeah,
proud to
it's
see
good.
the way you guys are turning tables.
I know. It's been amazing. We came so close a couple times, but it was so nice to have Heather win.
No, that was a great race.
Yeah.
Good stuff. What are your biggest targets? I mean, a little bit of defense, I guess.
A little bit of defense, yeah, and we do have another House district. It's a Senate district, and kind of make up the
coming closer to within reach.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely the other district is more north and more Republican.
We keep fielding good people. We keep chipping away at it.
Right.
Maybe we can
Right. Yeah.
So, thanks for what you're doing.
No problem. Hey, Mary, can you do a picture of us real quick? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I cut in line and get that done too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, man, this phone. Jeff, can we use...
We're good.
Oh, can't even work my own phone. But he can work it. Thanks for coming. This was really nice. Awesome. Thank you.
Candid one, the backup.
I saw you this afternoon or this
Yes, I was
morning.
gonna say,
Yeah. So thanks for being
Thanks
here.
for coming.
And
You got a bit of a
also
rerun,
see
but
tomorrow,
hopefully
so
it was
I'll let the next people do the line. But
say again?
I'll let some more people do the line. But, I'm glad you're coming to Iowa, and I'm really excited that you're running. I'm a gay man. I've been active in Iowa here as a gay man since the 80s.
Wow.
And,
That took a lot of courage.
I was just telling your hubby here that I'm not good about names, so never mind. But that I was first lady of Des Moines, and the guy I was dating was very active. with gay
No
folks in
kidding,
Des Moines.
really? So you know how that...
So in the 80s, it was a different story. And they couldn't have imagined anything like this. Even a year and a half ago, I don't know if we would have imagined this. But now, it's normal.
Well, you paved the way for folks like us to get this far, and hopefully we can make it easier for the next kid who comes along.
So, okay.
Thank you for that.
I'll run into you again.
I hope so. I look forward to it.
As many times as I get to.
Thank you. Thanks.
The room was over capacity. Hi, I'm the
Thank you for coming.
Scott McCormick, host and parking director.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you for looking after us. I saw you out in the lot, right? Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
I belong to Scott. We did the coffee.
So,
I saved you a bottle of water. You
Oh,
probably
good. Yeah, I was starting to drink it, and I think it went away.
Well, we'll
but
do
No, it's in the refrigerator.
One picture with you and your husband.
Oh, absolutely.
Which I will send to my brother and his husband.
Oh, good. Yeah.
You want to come in the middle?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. All right. Okay. There we
Got
go.
that.
Okay.
All right, we're ready.
Here we go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good luck.
Good luck.
Same here. Thank you for
I appreciate your thoughtfulness.
Sure,
I think
appreciate
it
you
was
welcoming
good
us.
to.
What a great group, too.
That was Mary. Mary, you just had a picture with before.
Yes.
That was hers. I just had the building and about 12
Well,
other
such a
people.
nice space, so thank you for that.
It worked. Now we get to clean it up. It's okay. All right, well, good luck to you. I wish you a good campaign, and you have a great message, and people listen. And
hopefully it touches down. So.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can watch it on Facebook Live too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And hopefully we'll see you
Good
soon.
luck.
Thank you again for working with us.
Sure. Oh, sure. I'll get you your water.
See you again. I was just going to say hi, but let's do this up.
Okay.
While I'm here, huh? Hi, nice to meet you. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to meet both of you. I'm Mather House, class of 03. No kidding. Yeah. You look a little familiar, man. Just because I spent a lot of time in Rob McCarthy's room, if you remember him. Yep. Those characters. Yeah, I was hissed in that too. Oh, really? Oh, wow. Yeah, so I'm sure. Yeah, we must have crossed paths. I stumbled past each other once or twice. Yeah, I also, I do theater in the Chicagoland area now, so I was excited to meet you too.
Yeah.
So,
Where are you doing anything currently?
A bunch of different things. I do like some freelance design, technical direction right now. I was the production manager at Drury Lane for a while. So
very cool.
Yeah, so
awesome.
And then I left because sometimes I also do field work for political candidates. So I did the last cycle. Hey, well, thanks for coming. Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely worth the drive. Good, nice to meet both.
Yeah, did you meet members of our team?
I haven't really. Steve.
You did an awesome
Nice
job.
group. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it was great. I was really impressed, and I've been talking around asking people what they all thought, and everybody was really impressed.
Really
So,
good.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
good to hear.
Good reception. Good job.
It seemed like really good. I love the kind of intergenerational quality. Like Stephen was telling me to expect that on the way in, but also just the numbers. I didn't know we'd see this many folks.
Yeah, that was great. Good event. Good building.
A lot of people have. So. Yeah. No, I remember first I ever heard of Ankeny was when you were explaining it to me, so it's cool to actually see it for myself.
Well, thanks for coming, and good trip. Good trip. So.
And you'll see her in the morning as well.
Oh, see, that's right.
Okay, yeah, we'll see you in the morning.
All right,
Okay,
we'll look forward to
see
it.
you
Thanks so
then.
much.
Bye.
Press over here.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks again for it.
Okay.
So we've got Kenny Henderson from State Radio Iowa.
I think the meter showed your loudest crowd response was when you talked about the groundbreaking nature of your candidacy.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
What do you think that says about where your party is today?
Well, I think it's that we're a party of inclusion, and we're a party that's always tried to move the ball forward, that each generation sees more possibilities than the last. I mean, I never would have imagined that I could be in this situation, and yet, my family, the family Chasten and I represent, our little household is one of the most important parts of my story, and one of the reasons we're doing this. So it shows you that times have changed, but we've also been reminded many times that the challenges continue, and there's a lot more work to do.
This is going to be a big field of candidates. It already is. It's only going to get bigger. What can help you stand out, do you think, for these Iowa Democrats who are ultimately going to have to make a choice a year from now?
Yeah, I think the bigger the better, actually. I think it's a moment in the party where we're deciding what the future is going to look like, and so the wider range of ideas and styles and tones and messengers we can have, the better. I can't really speak to the others, only to what I represent, but I think it's safe to say I'm not like the others, and we're going to keep seeing if this message resonates and bringing it out as far and wide as we can. Hopefully it continues to connect the way it has at the stops that we've been at today, which have been tremendously encouraging.
Before you arrived, I talked with a number of people here, and they kept using the phrase fresh face. How do you think that plays out as you compete with people who may not be as young as you?
Well, I think there's an appetite for something new and something very different. Now, that doesn't mean that something new on its own is enough, right? You got to show there's some substance behind it. And I'm looking forward to the stages up ahead where we'll really be able to dig in on plans and on vision. But I think people do want something different just because there's a sense that we're at this moment of turning the page. And frankly, that there have been a lot of weak weaknesses in the system, the economic system and the political system, that have helped lead us to where we are today. I think in many ways this presidency is more the symptom than it is the cause of the flaws in our political system and our economic system at the moment. And so I think the newer you are on the scene, maybe the freer you are of some of the habits and the strings that have made it hard to really be original in our politics today.
In Virginia, again, Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax was accused by a second woman, this time of rape. Where do you stand on this? Do you think he should resign?
So I've only caught this in kind of bits and pieces in the news that we've been going through our day. But from what I see, this is extremely disturbing. We're now talking about multiple allegations, and I do not see how he can continue to lead given what we've heard.
They won't know.
Given his work as a staffer, did you ever work with him in the past?
No, I had known people who spoke very highly of him, and I'm sure are pretty bitterly disappointed by today's news. But he's not somebody that I've worked with or interacted with closely.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. All right. Enjoying the weather?
Reminds me of home.
Yeah.
You've stopped telling a joke about how to pronounce your name?
Yeah, should I start? Should I resume? We'll get back to it. Yeah. As long as people can pick me out of the lineup, we'll be okay.
Okay, we'll be in touch. He's going to be in Johnson, but and if you send me anything that you do, so.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye. Good to see you again.
Sure, I don't think I agreed to do it.
I live here, so
Is that right?
Yeah.
Thanks for letting us scratch the
I appreciate it. I love your job. You talk all good.
Well, thank you.
We went and saw Elizabeth Warren when she was here.
Oh, all right. Yeah.
Down here.
That's exciting.
She's a fireball.
Oh, yeah. She's impressive.
But that place was mostly 2/3 women.
Is that right? Interesting. Yeah.
It was some special day. They were looking at the women and stuff, and she brought in all this crowd of people. Okay. And made this look like a picnic.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, no, they can get the crowds with that stuff.
I like what you got to say because I've been a Democrat my whole life. It's just too bad that you got to put up with the guy in charge right now. You know, he's killing the country.
Yeah. Well, now's our chance to do something.
I hope we do. Somehow or some way, we got to do it.
We're working at it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much for coming. Good luck with everything.
With this, too, you know,
Someone won't be able to too much. Too many people.
Well, and the press wouldn't have been able to be there, so it's nice that they could keep it in place.
Thanks for coming out.
It was windy. We had to stop early. We were going to try to drive straight through, but we stopped in Iowa City. The wind.
Yeah.
And I was worried about Max driving. About 7 hours.
Yeah. All right. Well,
There's not far. Yeah. 8 hours. You know when you
Who's taking names?
You are welcome. Happy to do it. This was a good turnout. There were folks here from, it was more than expected. Folks here from Osmosis. Do we know where that is and how far the drive is?
Sounds like
From Duluth, that's like 3 hours, right? That's the border. People from Nebraska.
That's
Okay. I can. And then just a lot of people that I didn't even know. So they weren't invited. There's a lot of people in here from other communities.
Where'd you move there?
It's an encouraging sign.
Yep, happy to do it. Yeah,
Thanks for what you're doing,
it
too.
worked.
It's been impressive to see how it's showing that we can make
We have to. We can't take a break. 2019 is another election. There's 16 seats in the Senate District 19 alone.
municipal seats. What's the cadence for the elections? Are those all
in the same?
You know, no, a few of them are in May, and then the rest of them are in November. So, okay. Yeah, so we got a lot of work to do. Get my foot better and get back on it. Get back knocking doors.
Thanks again.
You are welcome. Thanks for coming. I appreciate that. Yes, yes. Maybe tomorrow.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
in Johnston. All right.
Thank you. See you later.
All right.
All right,
Thanks again.
go. Thanks again.
Thanks for being here. Thank you. Sure appreciate it.
Thanks for reaching
My
out.
pleasure.
I tried to get you guys.
You missed your fiddle concert, didn't you?
Big pardon?
Your fiddle concert?
As a sweetheart.